Arch Linux. Arch Linux is one of the most popular Linux distributions out there, but for a lot of people, Arch Linux is kind of scary. The installation seems like it is very difficult to some people, and maybe it's above their skill set, but I promise you, the Arch Linux installation is not that difficult, and if you follow me step by step through this quick Arch Linux installation video I'm about to do, I promise you at the end of this video you will have a working Arch Linux install and you will be able to proudly say, by the way, I use Arch. Let's get started. So I did an Arch Linux installation video. Actually, I've done two of them in the past. I did one pre-recorded Arch Linux install, and I did a live stream one time of an Arch Linux install. But both of those videos are more than a year old, so I thought we needed to do a more up-to-date Arch Linux installation guide. But really, the catalyst for me wanting to do an Arch Linux install video this week is because over on Big Daddy Linux Live, that particular show every Saturday night, Rocco, Big Daddy Linux, they do a really nice live stream every Saturday night, and one of the things they do every week is they pick a distro to review the next week. So everybody installs whatever distribution and they review it the following week. Well, this past week, they chose Arch Linux for the next Big Daddy Linux Live show, and some people on the show and a lot of the viewers of the show are kind of fearful that they may or may not be able to get through an Arch Linux installation. I promise you guys, though, it's not that hard, and if you follow me step by step today, you will have a working Arch Linux installation. So first things first, to install Arch, you need to go grab the ISO. So you need to go to archlinux.org, and right here on the home page, go to the download tab. Click the download tab, and then down here, BitTorrent download, I would just grab the BitTorrent link and download the ISO through a BitTorrent. If you want to, though, I think they have some mirrors. You can search through the mirrors for an ISO if you prefer to download it over HTTP. Anyway, I've already got the ISO downloaded. It's not very big, just a few hundred megabytes. And then after that, you need to go to the Arch Wiki. If you go to the Arch Wiki, one of the very first things you see here is installation guide. You need to click that, and once we have the installation guide open, we're ready to begin. Now, the installation guide is not long. I've got it zoomed in a little bit. I've got the text a little bigger, so hopefully you can read it, but still, if I page down, how many times would I have to page down to get to the end? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 10 times, and that is, with me zoomed in, the font is about 120%. Normal size font, I may have to page down, I don't know, half a dozen times. It's not a very long page. And most of what's on the page will involve steps that we really don't even have to do. So it's not a scary install. People imagine that the Arch install is a lot scarier and maybe a lot lengthier as far as time commitment than it really is. So today I'm going to install Arch Linux inside a virtual machine. I'm going to install Arch Linux inside VirtualBox rather than installing it on physical hardware. I've installed it on physical hardware many times in the past. I've actually run it on my main production machine before, but it's hard to record these installations when you're doing the install on physical equipment. Plus, if you guys are new, and I'm coming at this really to help you guys that are brand new to installing Arch Linux, I suggest you actually do run through the installation in a VM before attempting it on real hardware, especially if you only have one computer. You don't want to wipe out your main production machine and try to install Arch Linux for the very first time without having gone through it in a VM, 2 or 3 times to kind of get your feet wet a little bit. Maybe run through the installation in VirtualBox half a dozen times to get really comfortable, and then, yeah, go ahead and blow away your main machine and try it on physical hardware. So today, again, I'm going to do this in VirtualBox. I suggest you do this in VirtualBox with me if this is your very first time installing Arch. So we need to create a virtual machine. I'm going to go to the machine menu here. I'm going to click new, and we need to create a new virtual machine. What are we going to name it? I'm going to name it Arch Linux. And VirtualBox is smart enough that when I type the name Arch Linux, it knows that the type of the operating system is Linux, and the version is Arch Linux 64-bit, so I don't have to do anything else there. I'm going to click Next. we need to give this virtual machine some RAM. The default setting is 1 gig of RAM. Now you can bump it up however much RAM your machine has. Now my host machine has 32 gigs of RAM, so I can give the VM here as much RAM as I want. Really, I'm just going to bump it up to 4 gigs. 4 gigs is plenty for what we're doing. I don't imagine you would need more than 4 gigs because I'm not going to get into anything that's going to eat a ton of RAM installing the base Arch Linux install. Click Next, and do we need to add a virtual hard disk? Yes, we are going to create a virtual hard disk for our virtual machine. So click Create, and then it's going to ask you what type of hard disk. VDI is the default, the VirtualBox disk image. I would just stick with that, no need to change that. Do we want this virtual hard drive, do we want it dynamically allocated or do we want it fixed to a specific size? Dynamically allocated is the default. I suggest leaving that on. Now, how big do we want to create this virtual machine? By default, most Linux VMs, VirtualBox suggests 8 gigs of space. Me personally, because I have plenty of storage on this machine, I like to bump that up a little bit. I like to create 15 gig VMs standard. 15 gigs is more than enough for about 95% of the Linux installs I ever do. It's rare that I come across a Linux installation that requires more than 15 gigs of space. So 15 gigs, plenty for what we're doing. All right, so we've created our new VM down here called Arch Linux. Now right click on it and go to Settings. Before we get started, there's some things I want to do. Now I'm going to click on System and go to Processor. Many of you guys have multiple core processors, and if you do, by default the VM is only using 1 core, so if you want to bump it up, here is where you do it. I'm going to give this VM 2 cores of my 12 core 24 thread CPU. So I'm going to bump it up, give it a little bit more processing power. Then I'm going to click the Display tab. Video memory is capped at 128 megabytes. That's not very much video memory. I suggest just going ahead and maxing that out every time you create a VM in VirtualBox. Graphics controller, by default it's set to VM SVG. I like setting it to VBox VGA. That's just me personally. If we end up getting into installing a graphical environment later, that particular driver tends to work better for me. Acceleration, do we want to enable 3D acceleration? Yes, tick that on. Again, we may not get to installing a graphical environment today, but if we did, having 3D acceleration enabled is kind of something that's important. Click the Storage tab here, and now this is where we need to attach the ISO. So Controller IDE, click the Add Optical Drive here and choose Disk. And then wherever you downloaded the Arch ISO, find it, click on it, hit choose, and you see the Arch Linux ISO is now appearing under Controller IDE. The only other thing I'm going to do, and you guys can ignore this, I'm going to go to the User Interface tab and tick that off and tick that off. And this gets rid of some of the extra cruft inside these VMs. I don't want it like the top menu of my VMs to show. I don't want the bottom sys tray in the VMs to show. I just want the VM, nothing else. Click OK. So we're ready to get started. Go ahead and launch the VM. So I'm going to go ahead. All right, so I fired up the VM and we get to the boot menu here, and we have some options here. We have boot Arch Linux, boot existing OS, run memtest, hardware information, reboot, and power off. The very first option, boot Arch Linux, is what we want to do. So we have booted into the live environment, and it automatically logs us in as the root user. There's only one user on the system right now. It's the root user. We're automatically logged in. What do we do? All we have now is the prompt. Now this is where a novice Linux user might get a little afraid. What do you do now? Well, this is easy. You go back to the installation guide and I will help you. I mentioned that we really don't have to read a lot of this installation guide. I will help you. Scroll down quite a bit on the installation guide, because the first paragraph is just basically an overview of what we're going to do. Download the ISO, verify the GPG key of the ISO. We should have done that, but that needed to be done on my host machine, not here in the VM. That's something you should probably do just for safety reasons. All right, keyboard layout. Here's the beautiful thing about keyboard layout. The default key map is a US keyboard, so I don't have to change this. We don't actually have to run this step. Verify the boot mode. In the VM here, I'm not going to worry about that. Verifying the boot mode is if UEFI mode is enabled on a UEFI motherboard, then the Arch ISO will boot Arch Linux accordingly via systemd boot, and you run this command just to make sure everything is alright with that, but whatever, not necessary in this VM. We also need to check and make sure we have working internet. Now I will do that because on the off chance that internet is not working, we really can't do much here. So let's ping. I'm going to ping google.com and hit enter, and we have internet. You see it's pinging Google, so you get something returned. Internet is working. Control-C on the keyboard to kill the ping. That's standard with a lot of shell commands, that run over and over again. Control-C will kill them. The next thing we need to do is go back to the Arch installation guide. It asks us to update the system clock. We need to make sure the system clock in the live environment is set correctly. So let's get back to the virtual machine, and I need to run the following command: time date CTL, all one word, space set-ntp space true. Run that command, hit enter, and then to verify everything is good, run time date CTL space status. Hit enter. And if everything, the time and date looks good, you're good. All right, so really the first, 20% of the Arch installation guide is stuff that is not necessary, really. The first thing that is absolutely necessary is partitioning the disk. Now, how do you partition the disk? They suggest using the command line utility fdisk. I don't like fdisk. It's confusing to me. I always have to read the man page to figure out how to use fdisk. cfdisk is a command line utility used to create your partition tables, and it's a lot easier to use in my opinion than fdisk. I'm going to use cfdisk. I'm not going to use what the Arch wiki recommends. So if I go back to the virtual machine, now the first thing you would want to do if this was on physical hardware is you might want to run like a lsblk. So, and see, what drives and partitions you have. Now, in this VM, I can tell you SDA. It's pretty much all we've got. This is going to be the disk that we're going to be writing to. So, cfdisk is what we need to run. cfdisk, and select label type. Now, in this VM, DOS is what we're going to choose. On physical hardware, you might do GPT, but GPT is meant for UEFI systems. DOS is meant for legacy BIOS system. I typically stick to DOS and legacy BIOS actually on my physical machines. I'm just like that. In a VM, it always makes sense just to do DOS. So this is cfdisk. It tells us how much space we have. Again, I created a 15 gig virtual machine here. All right, so let's go ahead and create this new partition from all the available free space that we have. So right now, new is highlighted at the bottom. That's correct. So let's go ahead and hit enter. Partition size. You know what? Let's go ahead and do two partitions. The main partition, the big partition for our file system, and then let's also create a swap partition. Even though the swap serves no purpose really in this VM, I normally wouldn't create it. You guys that are going to do this eventually on physical hardware may want to create a swap partition. So let's go ahead and do that. But let's do the big partition first. So 15 gigs, let's give 13 gigs to the big partition. It needs to be a primary partition. We need to make it bootable. Move over to the bootable tab there, hit enter. And you will see that in the screen here, boot now has the little asterisk under it. That means that partition is bootable. That's very important. All right, and now we still have some free space to play with. So let's move down to the free space that's left, which is 2 gigs. And again, create new. So hit enter. Partition size is 2 gigs. Now, primary or extended. Primary is fine. let's go over to type, because this needs to, instead of being type Linux by default, which is what it will be by default, we need to change this from Linux to swap. And I believe 82, type number 82 is Linux swap, and that is correct. Hit enter. And now we have the big 13 gig partition, and then we have a 2 gig Linux swap partition. That all looks good. I think we're ready to write this. So move over to write, hit enter, type the full word yes to write the partition table to the disk. So full word, yes, hit enter, and we're done. So now we can move over to quit, hit enter, and quit out of cfdisk. Now let's get back to the installation guide. So this was partitioning the disk, and again, it recommends using fdisk. I did not do that. I use cfdisk. It's a much easier tool to use. If you want to use fdisk and you're comfortable with it, that's perfectly okay. Me, though, I didn't bother. Now we're to the part where you need to go ahead and format those partitions we just created, right? So we need to make a file system, and it tells you exactly how to make an extend4 file system. If you wanted to make a btrfs file system, that would be okay too, or an extend3 file system. Extend4 tends to be the default on most Linux distributions, and to be honest, it's the one I typically go with myself because extend4 has been around for a while and it's rock solid stable. That's why so many Linux distributions use it by default. So let me clear the screen so you see what's going on here. So just type clear, hit enter. You could control L, I think, also to clear the screen too. I like typing it usually in my videos. I know it annoys a lot of you guys. Why don't you just hit the hotkey for it? Well, I would like to see that you guys get to see that I'm clearing the screen instead of things just magically go away. All right, so let's make the file system. mkfs for make file system dot ext4, which is the file system type we want to create, and then space, and then the location of that partition, /dev/sda1. It's pretty much the only thing available, because the only other partition we created was going to be the swap partition, and we're not going to do extend4 on that, so hit enter. Now we need to also make the swap. And you know what? Let's run lsblk one more time, just to make sure. So we ran the list block command just to make sure we have our partitions straight. Now we created to SDA1, which is the main partition, the extend4 partition, which we already created. SDA2 is the swap partition. So that's very important that we get this right. All right, to make the swap, here is the command in the Arch wiki guide. mkswap, make swap, and then the location. So back to the VM, mkswap. If I can type, space, and then of course /dev/sda2. So we have made the swap, and then we need to run the command swapon, all one word, space, and then again the location of that partition /dev/sda2. All right, so that is creating our disk. Now the next thing is we need to mount the file system, and basically the installation guide, the Arch Linux installation guide here in the wiki, is very straightforward. This is super easy. All you do is just copy and paste commands for the most part. It tells you that you need to mount the file system, and it gives you the exact command. The only thing, make sure you get the partition right. So in the command here, it says SDX1, X would be SDA or SDB, depending on how many drives you have in your machine. That's why they have the capital X there. You need to make sure you put the appropriate letter there. So let's go ahead and mount. Mount, and then space. Oh, I did not mean to hit enter there. Let's mount, space, and let me clear the screen since that is kind of too much going on there. Mount, if I can type. Well, I'm struggling today. All right, /dev/sda1 is where we need to be. So this is the extend4 file system, right? We need to mount that. We don't need to mount the swap. We're not doing anything else with a swap. Space, and then /mnt. All right, so that is mounted. All right, the next part of the Arch wiki is selecting our mirrors. Now we need to edit our mirror list. So it gives you the location of the mirror list, /etc/pacman.d/mirror list. That is where the plain text file that lists all the mirrors lives on the system. Now, they tell you, you might want to go in and edit that, but they really don't tell you how. This is one of the things about the Arch Linux installation guide that I think could be better, is they do assume you have some basic knowledge of Linux and the command line. How would you edit /etc/pacman.d/mirror list? Well, you have to edit it, of course, with a plain text editor. Do you know what plain text editors are available in the command line on Arch Linux? Well, there's two that are already installed for us. We could use either Vim or Nano. Now, assuming you're a newer Linux user, Vim is probably not an option. So we're going to choose Nano space and then the name of that file, /etc/pacman.d/mirror list, which I misspelled mirror list now that I'm looking at it. Hit enter. And this is our mirror list. And what you would do is you would go in and just start deleting all these lines. Control-K in Nano deletes lines. And you would delete all the mirrors that are not in the US in my case, because they will be slow. They will slow the system down every time I go to do an update and I'm trying to pull packages down from mirrors halfway around the world. It's going to be crazy slow. So pick mirrors that are close to you. So I'm editing this. So Control-K deletes lines, and I'm just deleting every line that has a server outside of the US. So say I'm on Canada here, so I'm going to Control-K to delete the Canada server, Macedonia, and then I'm back on one that says United States, so I'll skip over that, and then I'll delete Germany. Okay, got one in the US. Move on down, and after I have half a dozen or so of these, I'm probably good. We can always go back and edit this. You can get a new mirror list from the Arch Linux website. You can always come back and delete mirrors if some of these seem slow or you want to add mirrors back. It's not like you can't come back and change this anytime you want. So again, I'm just going to get a few of these set. So it looks like I've got about 7 or so. So that's plenty for purposes of this video. So I'm going to Control-K a million times until I get to the end of the list. Okay, this is taking a long time. See, this I would have been done had I chose Vim. Vim, one key binding, boom, done. But I didn't want to use Vim today. I don't want to scare away the noobs with Vim. So, all right, Control-X to get out of Nano. Y for yes to save. And yes, so it went ahead and wrote that, and we are good as far as a mirror list. All right, the next thing we need to do is pacstrap. Okay, now this is where the real installation begins. This command here, pacstrap space /mnt space base. We are about to install the base system. So pac, P-A-C, pacstrap, all one word, /mnt space base. Hit enter. And this is going to take some time. This is going to install the base Arch Linux system. So I'm going to pause the video. I'll be back once this is complete. All right, the pacstrap command is finished running. So let's get back to the installation guide. And the next thing is configuring the system fstab, which is the fstab is the file system table, and we need to run this command here. Again, it's mainly just reading the wiki, typing commands. So we need to run the command gen fstab space -U space /mnt space, and then 2 chevrons, 2 greater than symbols, space, and then /mnt /etc /fstab. Run that command. All right, and then the next thing we need to do, and let's go back to the installation guide. The next step is arch-chroot /mount. That's a very important step here. Wanted to make sure you guys got to read that. So arch-chroot space /mnt. So we're going to chroot into our newly installed Arch Linux. All right, back to the Arch wiki. All right, we need to set our time zone, and it gives this lengthy command here. And let me show you this actually in the terminal here. So if I go back, I actually have to type this. So ln space dash sf space, and then basically the location of our region and city we're setting our time zone here, which is /user/share/zoneinfo, and then /region. I know my region, America. And if I type it right, /city, I know the city of the time zone I want to go with. Chicago is in the central time zone in the US, so that works for me. Space /etc/local time. That is the command for me. Now, that might not be the command for you depending on what part of the world you live in. How are you going to get your region and city if you don't know? Well, I know this is right for me, so I'm just going to go ahead and run that. But if you're not sure about your region or city, I would run this command, ls, the list command, /user/share/zoneinfo. Run that command. And there are the regions you have to choose from. So you see here, America was in the list. So that's why I chose America for my region. Now, if you're not sure about the city, I'm going to up arrow one time to get my previous command back here in the bash shell, or actually ZSH is the default shell in Arch. ls user share zoneinfo and then /America to go one directory deep, so I know the region is America, but what cities are available. Hit enter, and you can see it lists all the cities. Chicago was in the list, but again, I already knew, because I've done this a few times, that America, Chicago is always my time zone. Okay, back to the installation guide. Now that we've set the time zone, the next thing we need to run is this command, hwclock. So hwclock, all one word, space, and then -- SISTOHC. Hit enter. All right, that was really easy. The next thing we need to do is localization. All we need to do, again, we're just reading the Arch wiki. Run this command, local-gen. Run that. All right, generating locales. Okay, so we generated all the locales. Then we need to read this particular file. After we run locale-gen, we need to go to /etc/locale.conf and make sure the locale is set correctly. So nano, again, we need a text editor to edit one of these text files. So /etc/lo, can't type today, locale.conf. All right, it is empty. What do we want to do here? Well, if I go back to the wiki page, you see that for English US, which of course is going to be my locale, lang equals English US UTF-8. So it gives me exactly what I need for English US. So I'm going to go ahead and just write that here. All right, language equals EN_US dot UTF-8. All right, that looks good. Make sure I copied it correctly. Yeah, everything looks good. So I'm going to Control-X in Nano to save, Y for yes. All right, the next thing we need to do is set the keyboard layout. Now, the keyboard layout by default is US keyboard here in Arch. I mean, that's why everything is working for me now. So I don't think I have to change it. I think you only need to do this if you're changing to something other than your typical US keyboard. So I'm going to skip that. Network configuration. All right, now we need to set our host name. So we need to go to /etc/hostname, which is a text file. Once again, remember text files, we need to use a text editor. So again, Nano or Vim if you prefer. I'm doing everything in Nano today. So Nano /etc/hostname. Hit enter. It's an empty file. Write whatever hostname you want, your hostname for the computer. I'm going to call my hostname DT. And Control-X to get out of Nano, Y for yes to save, hit enter. Back to the installation guide, the next thing we need to do is edit the hosts file, /etc/hosts. So it's a plain text file, so once again, Nano space /etc/hosts. All right, and this is a empty file. It's got 2 lines in it, but they've been commented out. So I'm going to arrow down a couple of times, and then all you really need to do is just put these 3 lines that are in the Arch wiki, put that in that file. So 127.0.0.1, and then tab over, and then write the word localhost. That's the first line. Hit enter, and then ::1, and then tab over, localhost, hit enter, and then 127.0.1.1, tab over your host name, my host name again, remember what we created, my host name DT, dot, the word local domain, all one word, tab over, and then again, my host name again. Remember, my host name is DT. Now, the only thing that you're going to type differently is the 2 places I type DT, you're going to type whatever host name you chose. Control-X to exit out of Nano, Y to save. Back to the Arch Linux installation guide, initram fs. This step here, it says it's not usually necessary because mk-init-cpio usually takes care of that during the pacstrap command we did earlier, so we actually can skip this. The next thing, setting a root password. Yeah, we can't skip that. So I'm going to clear the screen here, and I'm going to go ahead and create a root password. This is a standard Linux command. Anytime you need to create a password for a user, passwd. Hit enter. It's going to ask me for my new password for this user that we're logged in as. We're logged in as root. So this sets the root password. So I'm going to type a new root password. And it's going to ask me to retype it. Gave it something simple I can remember for purposes of this VM. Let's go back to the Arch Wiki installation guide. Guys, I'm at the end of the installation guide. The only section left, it says reboot. We're not going to do that just yet because there's a couple of problems with the installation guide. There's a couple of things we need to do, and I think we should do that before we do the reboot. So the first thing we want to do is there is a wiki page in the Arch Linux wiki for network configuration. You know, it never really talks about configuring the network in the Arch installation guide, but there's a separate kind of lengthy page about configuring the network. You may want to read that depending on whether you're doing a wired Ethernet connection or a Wi-Fi connection. Again, my machines are all plugged in on my host machine here. It's wired, so the VM is wired here. So I'm not fooling with Wi-Fi at all, no wireless. So all I need to do is enable the service DHCP-CD. How do you do that? Well, it's a service that you have to enable with systemd, the init system. So as root here, still root at arch-iso, system ctl space, and then enable space, and then DHCP-CD. Hit enter. And it created that symlink, and now when we reboot into our freshly installed Arch, it should enable DHCP-CD automatically, and I should have internet. Alright, the next thing we need to do is there is an Arch Linux page in the wiki for users and groups. Now, you may not need this depending on how experienced you are with the command line as far as adding users and editing users on the system, but I went ahead and pulled it up. I'm going to link to all these pages, by the way, in the show description. But the command we need, matter of fact, I may even leave the commands in the show description. By the way, that's thunder. I hope it doesn't pick up on the mic. There's a pretty bad storm all of a sudden that just flared up in the last few minutes. Anyway, you need this command here, user add space -m, and then the name of your user. So we're going to do user add, all one word, space -m, and then space and the name of my user. I'm going to call my user Derek. All right, and then we need to create a password for Derek. Remember how we did the password for the root user? We need to create the password for the Derek user with passwd. Now, passwd without any other arguments is simply going to change the password again for the root user, but to passwd space and then give it this argument, Derek. We want to change the password for the Derek user. Now, new password, so give it a password and confirm it. Passwords updated successfully. So now we've done two things that were not really in the installation guide. We enabled Ethernet. So when I reboot, hopefully I have internet on my freshly installed Arch. And now we have the Derek home user with his new password set up, as well as the root user. Now, Derek, we also want to add him to some groups. For example, he's going to want to have sudo privileges. That way we don't always have to su over to the root user to do anything that requires root privileges. So I want to go ahead and get him added to the sudoers file. By the way, I don't think Arch installs sudo by default. So let's do a quick where is space sudo. And nothing is returned, so sudo is not installed. So actually, let's install it. Pacman space -S space sudo. This will install the sudo program. Should just take a second. All right, the next command I want to run is we need to add the Derek user to the sudoers file. So first thing we need to do is add Derek to a group called the wheel group. That way he has root privileges. So let's go back to the user and groups wiki page. And right here, this command usermod space -a capital G space additional groups space username. That's what we need to add Derek to the appropriate groups. So as root here, still usermod space and then -a capital G space. And then what groups do we want to add the user to? Well, the wheel group is the important one. That gives us root privileges here in Arch. On some Linux distributions, you actually have to add yourself to a group called sudo. In Arch and other Linux distributions, the wheel group gives you sudo access. So the wheel group is the important one we need to add. You also need to add audio, comma, video, no spaces with the commas, video, comma, optical, comma, storage. Now, there's probably a few more groups I'll eventually add, like the VBox users group, because I use VirtualBox on all my installations, and other groups. But these are good enough just to get started here. So let's add that. And I forgot the last thing to do. User mod, and then all those groups, and the last thing space, and then the, of course, name of the user we're modifying. Okay, now that command is finished. Now let's double check and make sure we did that command correctly. So let's check what groups our users belong to. So if I type the command groups space and then whatever user I want to check on, Derek in this case, hit enter. And there we go. Derek belongs to the wheel, audio, optical storage, video group, and Derek group. He belongs to the Derek group by default. All right, so being a part of the wheel group, Derek has sudo privileges, but we still have to add him to a plain text file called the sudoers file. And how you do this, the safe way to do this is with this command, vi sudo, all one word. The vi sudo specified editor, vim, doesn't exist. Well, you know what? We can pacman -S vim. Let's go ahead and install vim. It just takes a second. All right, well, maybe more than a second. Vim is getting a little bloated these days. All right, and then run the command again, vi sudo. And this opens our sudoers file at /etc/sudoers. And for those of you not familiar with Vim, I know this is going to sound strange, but to go down with your cursor, J is down, K is up, H is left, L is right, the Vim keys. Anyway, go down to this line using J. I could get there faster, but those of you that are not familiar with VI or Vim, you know, we'll just stick with going down with the J key. All right, and eventually you're going to get to this line right here. It says uncomment to allow members of group wheel, remember Derek belongs to the wheel group, to execute any command, meaning I have root privileges. So you see my cursor right now is under that pound symbol in Vim. X on the keyboard will delete the character you're currently on. So just X, and we uncommented that line. That's all we needed to do. We need to quit out of this. To quit out of Vim, this is very complicated, colon, W for write, Q to quit. Hit enter. All right, and I think that's it. I think we could reboot right now. All right, I really think that we're close to being done. There's only one thing I know that we have to do before we reboot. We never installed a bootloader. I don't know, did I miss that in the installation guide? Because we were down to the end of the installation guide. reboot. Actually, right before it says reboot, bootloader. Yeah, you need to install a bootloader. It doesn't tell you how to. It just links you to the bootloader Arch wiki page. So bootloaders, I can tell you we're going to install grub. I will make this easy. Just follow along with me as I install grub and configure it. So we need to install grub. So as the root user, pacman space -S to install a program. Name of program, grub. All right, hit enter, and it will install the grub2 bootloader. This may take a second. All right, grub is installed. One other thing we need to do is run the command grub-install space, and then the name of the disk that we're putting grub on, and in my case it's /dev/SDA, SDA, not SDA1, SDA2, we're just SDA, right? Hit enter, and you can see it's installing, installation finished, no error reported. One last command, because we installed grub, but you do have to configure it. There has to be a grub config file, otherwise when you reboot, nothing's going to happen. And to create that grub config file, you need to run the following command. So you need to run grub-mkconfig space -o space /boot/grub/grub.cfg, grub config basically. Hit enter. Then it creates our grub config. I think we can reboot. I think we can go ahead and reboot, and we will have a freshly installed Arch Linux. But the first thing we have to do is in VirtualBox. First of all, let's kill the VM. So in the VM, we need to exit out of the chroot. All right, and then we need to shut down now. And all right, we shut down the VM. I'm going to switch views here. I'm going to go back to VirtualBox. Remember our VM we created, Arch Linux? Right-click on it, go to Settings. In Settings, you remember the Storage tab where we attach the ISO? We need to detach the ISO. Highlight it and go down here to this red X where it says Remove Selected Storage Attachment. And click on it, and it removes the ISO. It detaches the ISO. This is the same as unplugging the USB stick out of your machine. Now let's fire up our VM and see if it works. All right, and it boots up just fine. It boots us into a prompt, DT login. So it's asking for a login. We have two users on the system. Remember, we have root is already there, of course, and then we created a user called Derek. Let's see if we can log in as Derek. So type in Derek, hit enter, or whatever user you created. It's going to ask for Derek's password. All right, and we are logged in. You can see Derek at DT, my username at the host name we created earlier. So let's see if we have working internet, because this is very important. Let's ping google.com again. We have working internet, and we do. That's it. We have our root user, our home user. We have working internet. We're good to go. That is a base Arch Linux installation in a VM. If you followed along to this point and you've gotten to this point, you are pretty much there. There's really nothing else to do. I mean, nothing I'm going to do on this video, because where you go from here, every person's going to be different, right? Now, from here is where you start installing all your graphical applications. What desktop environment do you want to install? Do you even want a graphical environment? If you do, obviously you have to have the Xorg server on your system. Do you want to do GNOME, KDE, XFC? Do you want to do window manager only, like OpenBox, Fluxbox, Xmonad, Qtile, i3? Awesome. And then, of course, all your programs. I mean, what text editor do you want to use? What file manager do you want to use? What web browser do you want to use? So everyone is going to be different at this point, so I'm not going to go over this. The only thing I will go over is if you want a graphical environment, you do have to install Xorg. So since I know we want to do Xorg, sudo, because I'm logged in as Derek now, so I have to invoke sudo to install or remove software. Sudo pacman-S. I'm just going to type one word, Xorg. It's going to ask me for my sudo password. And what Xorg programs do I want? There's 50 members of this group. By default, it's going to install all of it. Yeah, I want the whole Xorg. And confirm. This download is going to take a couple of minutes, but that's going to get us the X server, the graphical server. At that point, you need to dig into the Arch wiki and figure out how to install your favorite desktop environment or window manager. For me, let's say I want to install, and I'm just going to throw something out there, the awesome window manager. All I would do at this point is sudo pacman-S awesome WM, the package name for awesome window manager. And I have my window manager. I need a login manager. I strongly suggest, if you need a login manager, LightDM. Now, if you install GNOME or KDE, like the Total package, they have their own login managers kind of bundled in with them. You don't have to worry about login managers with those desktop environments. But if you do more minimal desktop environments, and certainly if you do window manager only, you want probably a login manager. Again, LightDM is what I would go with. And that's it. That's all we're doing here. That's the base Arch Linux installation guide for 2019. If you've never installed Arch Linux, again, just do it in a VM, because in a VM, you can't mess anything up, right? I mean, you can mess things up, but you're not really doing it on your physical machine. You didn't wipe anything out, you know, to try out Arch Linux and then, oh, I failed. You know, try it in a VM about half a dozen times. Again, the installation is not very long. If I go back to the installation guide, remember, I mean, this is the installation guide at the top. I'm going to scroll back down. I'm going to scroll down here. This is not a very long installation guide. Now, not everything is in here. I had to pull up along the way the Arch boot process page where you might want to read about it if you're not familiar how to get grub installed and configured. I also pulled up the network configuration page. You're going to want to do this, especially if you're putting this on a laptop and need to figure out how to get wireless up and working. You're probably going to want that page. And then the users and groups page I also pulled up. I'm going to link to all of this in the show description. I'm going to try to include all the commands that I ran on camera in case there's any confusion about them. I'm going to try to put all of that in the show description as well. And good luck. I think you guys should be able to get this up and running in no time. And I think, you know, from start to finish, a brand new user, I mean, you're going slow, you're typing carefully, but from start to finish, what we did on this video today should take you about an hour. In about an hour, you should be done. You should reboot and be able to have internet. You should have your user created, and you should be able to tell all your family and friends, by the way, I use Arch Linux. Before I go, this show was made possible by Ansem, Chris, the other Chris, Douglas, Dylan, George, Jack, Leor, Mitchell, Philip, Rob, Robert, Sam, Tony, and Willie. They are the producers of the show, my highest tiered patrons over on Patreon. Without these guys, this Arch Linux installation guide for 2019 would not have been possible. Show's also brought to you by all those other fine ladies and gentlemen, all those names you see on the screen. Those guys help support my work over on Patreon. Again, without each and every one of them, this show wouldn't be possible. I want to sincerely thank those guys, and if you'd like to support the channel, please consider doing so. You'll find me at DistroTube over on Patreon. All right, guys. Peace.